In London, this is The Economist, and this is the week ahead. A look at some of the stories that will be in the headlines in the week beginning February the 2nd. I'm Tom Standage, the digital editor.
And I'm Tom Wainwright, the homepage editor. In the week ahead, talks resume between Iran and the UN's nuclear agency. There are two very different elections in Central America. Two big sporting events kick off. And London stages a multi-million-dollar auction of modern art. Now, Tom, there are so many talks going on at the moment with Iran, I've slightly lost track of where we are. Can you tell us what these latest ones are all about?
Well, there are two sets of nuclear negotiations going on with Iran at the moment, and this is the sort of less well-known one that's been going on for quite a long time. So last year, at the end of last year, a deal was struck between 6 world powers and Iran agreed to freeze some of its nuclear enrichment and also to allow more access and provide more information in return for a slight easing of the economic sanctions against it. And that's an interim deal. It takes effect for 6 months. It actually took effect on January the 20th. And the idea is that that then paves the way for a comprehensive deal that's already being negotiated. At the same time, the IAEA, which is the UN's nuclear watchdog and which is actually responsible for enforcing that deal with the 6 world powers, has its own set of negotiations going on with Iran. And they also did a deal at the end of last year where Iran agreed to provide access to some things it hasn't actually allowed inspectors into for some time. Notably, there's a uranium mine, and inspectors just visited that in January for the first time since 2005. So again, there's sort of more openness there. And this goes back to a report that the IAEA put out in 2011 that said that Iran either still had or in the past had a military dimension to its nuclear program. This is something Iran has always denied, and the IAEA is determined to get to the bottom of it. And so these talks that are happening next week are a continuation of that process. And the thing is that the deal with the world powers depends on all issues being resolved. So this is potentially a stumbling block to broader progress.
And will we see stumbles?
Well, we're already starting to see some grumbling. So the deal that was done between the world powers and Iran last year had a massive amount of fudge in the middle of it over whether Iran had the right to continue to enrich uranium or not. It didn't say they couldn't, so the Iranians took that to mean they had the right to. And so in America, some politicians are saying that this is giving Iran too much and that the deal is too generous. In Iran, meanwhile, the president there, President Rouhani, is under pressure both from conservatives who think that he's negotiating, giving away too much, and at the same time from reformists who say that he hasn't delivered on his promises of reform, which is what got him elected last year. So actually there are quite a lot of spanners in the works potentially here. Another example this week was that Iran formally criticised Barack Obama for suggesting in his State of the Union speech that it was the pressure of sanctions that had got Iran to the table, and Iran was saying no, that had nothing to do with it. So already there's signs of sort of disagreement. And so I think the thing to be watching for this week is whether we've actually reached a high watermark of progress with Iran over the nuclear issue, or whether there's still scope for further progress to be made. Okay, let's turn now to Central America, where on February the 2nd we've got 2 presidential elections taking place. What should we be looking for?
Well, these are 2 very different elections in 2 extremely different countries. One is happening in Costa Rica, which is a sort of oasis of tranquility in what's a very difficult region. The other is in El Salvador, which is rather a different kettle of fish. If we start with Costa Rica, this is one of the world's oldest democracies. They've had elections there since 1949, which was the same year that they abolished their armed forces, as many people know. It enjoys a high rate of literacy, high life expectancy, even compared with the United States. And it looks as though the election campaign has been a characteristically straightforward affair. The ruling National Liberation Party looks likely to win. Laura Chinchilla, the president, can't run again because of term limits, but the candidate from her party, former mayor of San Jose called Johnny Araya, at the moment has the edge in the polls. The polls have been narrowing a little bit, and it looks as though it probably will go to a second round. That's what happens if no one wins more than 40%. If that does happen, it will only be the second time in Costa Rica's history that that has gone ahead, and it looks likely that the second place candidate will be Jose Maria Villalta of the left-wing Broad Front party. So we can expect a close-ish race, but it looks as though the ruling party will probably retain the initiative.
Okay, so that's the very sort of orderly election we've got going on in Costa Rica. Meanwhile, in El Salvador,
something slightly different. El Salvador is a troubled place, whereas Costa Rica is synonymous with pura vida, as they say there, the sort of easy life. El Salvador is a place that's had a difficult history of revolution and violence and civil war and so on. Things have changed though recently. Nearly 2 years ago, the two main gangs there, the Maras, signed a truce that was brokered by the government. Now, this has been incredibly controversial because it's involved the government dealing with these ruthless gangs, who are the people who murder and extort their neighbours, basically, in El Salvador. But it seems to have worked in many ways. The murder rate in El Salvador has fallen by more than 50% since the truce was signed. So El Salvador has gone from being one of the world's most violent countries to being merely an extremely violent country, which is progress of sorts. The public, though, are very divided about this because of the controversy involved with the government dealing with criminals. People are happy about the murder rate going down, but they're not totally relaxed about the way that it's been brokered. And these mixed feelings are reflected in polls. It looks as though it's going to be a very close race. The ruling FMLN party, whose candidate, Salvador Sanchez, is a former guerrilla fighter, is sort of neck and neck with the Arena party, which is a right-wing, very strongly anti-crime party. It looks as though their candidate, Norman Quijano, has the slight edge at the moment. But again, this is another election which looks as though it might well go to a second round. If they have that, that will be in March in El Salvador, and we can expect a fairly close contest between the ruling FMLN and the right-wing Arena party. So if we turn from these two elections to two sporting events now, we've got the Super Bowl in the States and the Sochi Winter Olympics. Nobody's really interested in the sport, though, are they?
Well, I wouldn't say nobody is, but what's very striking about both of these events is that what happens on the field or on the piste is very much overshadowed by the marketing that surrounds these events. So the Super Bowl is as much to do with the halftime show and the TV ads as it is to do with the actual sport. And the TV ads in particular have been getting more and more prominent. The internet allows the advertisers to release their ads early, and this is something they've started to do in the last few years. So now, instead of this being a time to capture the attention of tens of millions of viewers and buying your 30-second slot, which this year is costing about $4 million, you've actually got 2 to 3 months of Super Bowl related promotion going on both before and afterwards, and it's become quite accepted now for either the entire ad or a teaser for the ad to be released before the Super Bowl to try and get people to watch it. Or another thing that some companies are doing is they're making sort of long ads, several minutes long, and then they're just doing a sort of cut down version of it that appears in the Super Bowl, and then they can say it's a Super Bowl ad. And this year the ad that has sort of gone viral, but not for the reasons that the company behind it would have wanted it to, is the ad from SodaStream featuring Scarlett Johansson. SodaStream is an Israeli company, and they have a factory in an Israeli settlement in disputed territory. And so this has proved very controversial. The company says that although it employs Palestinian workers and is therefore bridge building, its critics take a very different view. So that has been dominating the discussion of the ads that are associated with the Super Bowl this year.
And the Sochi Winter Olympics isn't without controversy by any means, is it? But what can we expect to see there?
Well, there, instead of this being all about, again, what's happening on the ski slopes and on the ice and so on, Sochi, I think most people are associating more with this enormous amount of money that Russia has spent to stage the Winter Olympics in a subtropical resort. And the other thing, as well as the allegations that corruption has inflated the cost of this, there is also the aspect of the homophobic position that the Russian government has taken. It thinks that it's defending traditional Russian values. It thinks that giving any sort of concessions to gays is a sort of concession to Western decadence. And so there's very, very clear division. And so we're very likely to see both formal and informal, quite subtle protests from athletes expressing their support for gay and lesbian people. So in both of these cases, the sport is in danger of playing second fiddle to the window dressing that goes around it, and the assessment of who's done the best job, not actually of on the field or on the slopes, but of getting their message across. Finally, Tom, we've got a big modern art auction coming up in London. Given the wobbles in the markets, is this the sort of thing that people are more or less inclined to spend money on, do you think?
Well, Christie's, the company that's holding the auction, certainly hopes that people are going to shell out. They're optimistic that they might get more than £200 million for these works. That's more than $300 million. And there are certainly some gems in the collection. There's work there by Picasso, Magritte, Miro, some of the finest works of the 20th century. Now, some people wonder if the economic conditions are quite right to be selling multi-million-dollar works of art. The economic recovery in the West is really only just getting underway, and in many emerging markets we've seen currency wobbles in recent days. But the auctioneers are optimistic that people might see art as a relatively safe place to put their money. And if we look at the recent track record, actually, it seems as though modern art, if anything, anything is the type that's most likely to fetch a high price. And it looks as though actually conditions at the moment aren't too bad. It was only in November that a work by Francis Bacon, 3 Studies of Lucian Freud, fetched a record price, record for an auction sale anyway. So there certainly is money out there, and Christie's will be hoping to attract it at the auctions this week.
Well, that's our framing of the coming week. Join us again next week for another look at events in the week ahead. In London, this is The Economist.
The Economist.